valuable thing, can be a really valuable thing. So I want to take a moment to remind you what I said I was an expert at, and it was this. So now you all know me a little bit better, and maybe you've read something I wrote, and what do you think? Is that what I limit myself to? Yeah, I hope not, right? That would be kind of pathetic, really tiny. But this is actually how my publisher saw me when my book was coming out. And the reason I know that is because I saw it in the marketing materials, in which they referred to me as the Little Red Riding Hood lady. And I saw my book,
Riding Hood what?
Lady.
Lady.
Yeah, and
Nice.
some of the correspondences. And yeah, they thought all that kind of cute stuff. They thought that they should have some Little Red Riding Hood cookies at my book party, and they compared my book to academic books on fairy tales, none of which had sold more than a few thousand copies. And every time I talked to my publisher, I just felt low. I felt like, that's not my book at all. Like, who are they talking about? I'm not an academic. I didn't really think of my book as really being about fairy tales, except as a metaphor. And, but I thought, I'm a first-time author, what could I do? They're a big publishing house, I should let them do their job. And then a few months went by and we had the marketing meeting and the publicity people, and again, it was like Little Red Riding Hood lady, and it was like almost like I had written a children's book, and I thought, God, this is not my book at all, but what could I do? I should just let them do their job. What do I know? Then my pub date was upon me. And have you ever had one of those pounding headache ulcer combos? Yeah, you know what I mean. So I had one of those, and it was just screaming at me, oh my God, if someone doesn't do something fast, I am forever going to be the Little Red Riding Hood lady. And then I had an epiphany, which was, and that person should be me. Because who else would do anything about it? Honestly, really, who else would do anything about it? So I thought I need to reframe this, and I need to do it now. I need to do it fast, and I need to do it now. So the first thing I did is I thought I had better look for some angles on what I know. And how many angles do you think I looked for? 3. Yeah, of course. Is there a better pen over here? Is there a black pen maybe, or that red pen, or both?
I've got markers.
Yeah. All right. So the first thing I did is I drew a triangle, and then I'm a journalist, and journalists are trained to ask really basic questions like who, what, when, where, why, how. In fact, they are on some of the pages around the room. And I thought if I could identify just a couple of angles, I'd be better off. So the first thing I asked myself was who? Who am I an expert on? And I looked and I'm like, well, that's obvious. I'm an expert on Little Red Riding Hood, the fairy tale heroine. Does everyone get what I'm doing here? I'm looking for specific angles. Then I went over here and I asked myself, what am I an expert on? And I thought, oh, well, similar answer. Little Red Riding Hood, the fairy tale, not the heroine this time, but the fairy tale. Is everyone with me? And then I went up here and I asked myself, where, if I could give a location for my expertise, and I wrote the nursery. So that's already a little better, but still pretty narrow, and I thought, I really need to broaden this. I need to figure out how I can broaden this. How can I expand on these angles? So the first one I did was over here, and I thought, well, actually, Little Red Riding Hood was in the center of my triangle because it was in the title of my book, because it was the through line. But I looked at all kinds of fairy tale heroines. So I thought, the first thing I could do is cross that out. I'm an expert on the fairy tale heroine. Then I thought about that, and I thought, well, I looked at biblical texts and Celtic lore and mythology and Victorian chapels and pornography and YouTube and werewolf broads. I mean, I looked at all kinds of genres, not just fairy tales. I realized that the only reason I was calling them fairy tale heroines is because of that convention we have of referring to plot lines about women by their fairy tale names. But actually, I looked at heroines in all kinds of genres. So I thought, I can broaden that to heroines. And then I broadened it one more. Can anyone guess to what?
Women.
Yes. So I never would have said I was an expert on women before I did this because I don't know everything about women. I bet there are some of you in the room who were feeling like that this morning. Yeah? But when I did this, I thought, I could see a straight line from this to this. And I knew what I knew here, and I knew it's stone cold. There aren't many people on the planet who know more about this fairy tale than me, and I know most of them on a first name basis. And I thought, I know this stone cold, and I can see the straight line, and I thought, I don't know everything about women, but who does? On the other hand, I just wrote a book looking at 500 years of stories about women across all these continents, and I think I could say I'm an expert on women. So I did. And then I went over here, and again, I crossed out Little Red Riding Hood because that was just the through line. And I had, okay, I'm an expert on the fairy tale. And I hated talking about my book. Because every time I said that, inevitably people would say, did you write a children's book? And I would see their eyes glaze over. Then one day I heard someone talk about the myth of Red Riding Hood, and I thought, oh, that's so interesting, it sounds much better, right? I had never called it that before, because in folklore, myth and fairy tale are completely different categories. They are different numbers on the Arne Thompson Tale Type Index, which tells you how wonky I am. You would never confuse them. But then I realized that in regular conversation, myth and fairy tale are different things as well, but not for reasons of academic folklore or whatever. They're just completely different, different reasons, popular, regular conversation reasons. So for example, which one's big and which one's small? Myth or fairy tale, which one's big?
Myth.
Which one's important?
Myth.
Which one's male?
Myth.
Yeah, that's not actually speculation. I actually wrote my book because of that, because there's a body of literature about something called the hero cycle, which by cycle is a story we tell over and over again, and by hero they mean protagonists. So the protagonists of global stories. And if you've read Joseph Campbell, you've read some of the more popular literature, but actually there's a lot more. And if you read it, it's as if women don't exist as protagonists in all of narrative history. It's bizarre, and it's not true. And one of the things that's so interesting in folklore is that you can trace the evolution of stories. And you can see that actually what's going on is these stories changed significantly when they were written down. So the way we trace stories is just like biologists trace the evolution of species. You collect samples and you date them, and then you build a phylogenetic tree, and you can get a pretty good idea of what their root stories look like. And if you look at the oral stories that predate a lot of our most common myths or big epic stories, they're really very different. They're very different, and this one in particular is very different. Back when they were often told, by the way, by women, which is where we get the term wives' tale. It has to do with reasons of work and who told stories. But back before that term came to mean a lie. And, well, I won't tell you all the ways that they're different, but I will tell you that this one in particular, the early origins of this story are completely uncool for children. They're cannibalistic and really sexual and really violent. But there's one thing that almost all of them have in common, which none of the versions that you read to your children have anymore. And it's that she almost always wins. So anyway, I thought I'm going to stop buying into this idea that stories about men are epic and stories about women are tiny or infantilized. I'm going to start calling it the myth of Red Riding Hood, and that's what I did. And it's funny because my academic advisors thought that was fine. They understood why I was using that word. I broadened it one more because all of that is very fancy-pantsy, and I'm not a very fancy-pantsy girl, so I needed a simple word to talk about it in a bigger way, and that was the word I used, stories. Then I went up here and I thought, the nursery, wow, well, somehow this no longer felt relevant to me. I don't have kids, I don't have a nursery. Fairy tales were not for, and still are not for children, except for a tiny sliver of their existence in history, which I barely write about and am not that interested in, so I just crossed it out. And then I went back to the questions, who, what, when, where, why, and I thought, you know, why did I pick fairy tales? And the reason is because they're global. They are among the most global of human stories. They appear in every continent across centuries, so that you can compare people across time and space. They outcirculate the Bible in some places in written form, and in oral form they're considered among the most popular of human stories. And that's actually the arena, if I wanted to broaden it, that I was engaging in, popular culture. So can anyone see can you all tell what happened to my triangle? A lot bigger, and I could make it bigger than that if I wanted to. So I want to tell you what this meant for me in my book. Before I do that, I want to just say, I'm not Stephen King or Tom Clancy or whatever. Like, my book was not The Lovely Bones. But it did have a really different life from the one my publisher imagined it would have. My book was supposed to be a tiny backlist seller. I was like an unknown author that had been picked up from, out of a newspaper. And, it was supposed to just be, like a quirky book on the side. They didn't imagine it would ever get reviewed. In fact, my book was reviewed all over the place. Every major outlet, the Times, the Post, the Journal, Newsweek. It was fodder for at least 3 different op-eds in the New York Times, one of which you read. It appeared in the Museum of Modern Art. We went and met with the HBO folks about doing a TV series, you never know if that will ever happen. And it was used last year by Catherine Hardwicke for a major motion picture, Red Riding Hood, which was really fun. By the way, her movie is a goth teenage fantasy, not my book, but my book is used in the movie, and some of the scenes from the movie come from the book. And I still get royalty checks for it, which is interesting. You know, my book outran its print run before its pub date, which doesn't tell you much about the numbers of the money, but it does tell you a lot about expectations. It tells you that my book exceeded my publisher's expectations even before its pub date. And that's all a really unusual thing to happen for a tiny little academic book on fairy tales. Except, that's the thing, my book is not an academic book on fairy tales. It's a book about women and the stories that are told about us everywhere and surround us in our lives and how that shapes our lives and who we are. And I think that's a much better book, don't you? So just so you don't think that this applies only to me, I want to give my favorite example of somebody else. And there was a woman who, there's so many examples and they're so beautiful, but my favorite is this woman who came in and she said she was an expert, she was an academic, she was an expert in the political implications of rumor in 18th century France. On dit. Who wants to read that dissertation? Not a one? Not even Kristen? Not a one. It's a snooze, right? For most of us, that's a real snooze. And actually, it was for her as well. You could tell. You could tell the hangdog look on her face. Can you imagine 10 years with that in your back pocket at a cocktail party? So she felt pretty much useless and uninteresting to almost everyone. But she did this exercise, and here's what emerged after a few minutes. She realized, I'm an expert in the political implications of rumor, of informal communication in 18th century France, which was an era when new ideas of public were forming. People were gathering in ways that they hadn't gathered before, and they were talking about people that they didn't know firsthand in ways that they hadn't done before. And the implications were revolution. Who better than her to talk about the political implications today of informal communication today, like Twitter and Facebook, which are also revolutionary, shaping the world, completely changing our industries and the economy. And there aren't that many people who can talk about that with historical perspective. But she can. And she went from being all but uninteresting and useless to almost everybody, at least us in this room, to being potentially very interesting and very useful, and by the way, very fundable to almost everybody in just a few minutes. And it was all in her head. So, a couple things. One more thing I want to say about this is also a fantastic way to see how your ideas might intersect with other people's in different fields. If we had a bunch of easels and we all did this, I bet you we could daisy chain each other around the room. Because I bet not many of you are interested in this, but I bet you some of you are interested in my outer corners, and if not mine, then in somebody else's who overlaps